Welcome to Free Associations, the podcast for anyone who's ever wondered if they should believe the news when it comes to health advice. I'm Matt Fox, a professor of epidemiology and global health at Boston University and an HIV researcher. Today, in the first part of our podcast, we're going to be talking about a study that has hit the news and takes on the topic we all care about. We're going to dig into whether or not moderate drinking is good for your heart. So hang on before pouring yourself that glass of wine so we can sort it all out. In the second part of the podcast, we'll get into the issue of what studies the media chooses to report on and focus on. And then in our third segment, our amazing and amusing segment, we will talk about the things that make us enjoy our jobs. Now, as we get into our first segment, let me introduce you to the group. I am joined here by Dr. Chris Gill. Chris, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, Matt. Chris Gill here. Yes, I'm an associate professor of global health. I'm an infectious disease doc by training.
Excellent.
And a talk show host. And Dr. Don Thea.
And yeah, my name's Don Thea. I'm part of this group. I'm also an infectious disease specialist, and I'm a professor in the Department of Global Health.
Excellent. Okay, let's get into our first segment. In the first segment, we're going to be assessing a new study from the United Kingdom by Stephen Bell and colleagues that was published in the British Medical Journal that looks at the relationship between alcohol consumption and cardiovascular events. The study is titled Association Between Clinically Recorded Alcohol Consumption and Initial Presentation of 12 Cardiovascular Diseases, Population-Based Cohort Study Using Linked Health Records. We'll dive into the details of the study, we'll break it down, and we'll try to see in the end what we think of the results. So as always, I'm going to get us started with some headlines that have come out about this study. So Time Magazine says, alcohol is good for your heart, most of the time. The Guardian says moderate drinking may reduce heart disease risk, which I appreciate their may. Really atypical. The Register says, good news, everyone. 2 pints a day keeps heart problems at bay. That may be some overinterpretation. And Science Daily says moderate drinking linked to lower risk of some, but not all, heart conditions. And then you should also know that the Wine Spectator says alcohol could reduce risk for certain heart diseases. I have no reason to believe that they are biased in any way, so I take that as a given.
What did the Russians say?
I'm not even going to look. Not even going to look. All right, so Don, let me start with you. Can you give us an overview of what this study did and what it was about, what they found?
Sure, Matt. A really interesting study that was done really in the context of many years of alcohol research looking at this relationship between alcohol consumption and cardiac effects. And there have been lots of studies that have seemed to indicate that mild alcohol consumption has a protective effect on cardiovascular disease. And in fact, there's a paradox called the French paradox, which
I think I saw that movie.
wherein the amount of cardiovascular disease and associated conditions are less in French populations, and French populations are known to consume a lot of red wine, among other things. So beginning with those observations, there's been quite a robust portfolio of research that has looked at this issue. And that's really what this study is about. And what this study attempts to do is use enormous numbers of people enrolled over a period of time to try to tease out some of the both inputs which would be really the degree of alcohol consumption, and some of the more sort of detailed outputs. So we have a hypothesis, which is supported by some evidence, that alcohol decreases the development of atherosclerosis, cardiovascular disease, strokes, all sorts of different cardiac or vascular effects. But the numbers have never been large enough, really, to be able to tease those out, because you need large numbers. So in this study, they enrolled almost 2 million participants. From a program in England called Caliber, which is cardiovascular research using linked bespoke studies and electronic health records, which is really a database that accesses information from all of the primary healthcare physicians and general practices in England, and they are able to aggregate this data and look at various inputs and various outputs. And What they did was they basically stratified those patients into these risk categories, or really the categories in terms of the amount of alcohol that they consumed, going from no alcohol consumed to lots of alcohol consumed. And then they did an analysis, and the group against which they compared the extremes was moderate alcohol consumption. So they looked at what is the effect on all of these 12 disaggregated outputs of no alcohol consumption, or teetotalers, as well as heavy alcohol consumers, in terms of these various effects. So, I think it's a quite unique study that allows us to really look in a detailed way with some of these outcomes, in large part because of the large numbers.
And I would just add, I think what they did here that is presumably novel compared to the studies that have come before it is they did some stuff around how they did their comparisons that we'll get into, but they also were able to disaggregate the kinds of cardiovascular events. So the previous literature has mainly focused on just cardiovascular disease events,
Myocardial infarctions,
heart attacks, right? And they were able to, because they have this massive database, to look at more rare events and to separate out the types of events.
And then part of the issue is that these events may travel together. They may be confounded by one another, because cardiovascular disease and myocardial infarction and high blood pressure and all the rest of that stuff travel together, and you need large numbers to be able to
risk factors party together.
That's right.
And so they found this what we refer to as this sort of U-shaped curve, where moderate drinking is better than no drinking, and moderate drinking is better than a lot of drinking. And this is a pattern that's been seen quite a bit when looking at the study, although there have been some studies that have contradicted this, and it suggested that maybe the reasons for this are explained by certain types of bias. But we'll get into that. So Chris, give us your take on this study. What'd you like? What'd you not like?
Well, I thought it was an interesting idea to try to unpack this risk group that in many previous epidemiologic studies has been comprises the non-drinking group. And here they said, well, non-drinkers are really of three types, right? And they shouldn't necessarily be considered to be equivalent. They're the people who are like true non-drinkers, as in they never drank and don't drink. And then there are ones who used to drink and now don't. And so those are former non-drinkers. And then there's the ones who call themselves non-drinkers, but what they really mean is that they don't drink very much. Mm-hmm. Like they hardly ever drinkers, but they're not abstainers. They're just rarely drinkers. Yep. And yet those all tend to get lumped into one group.
You have a glass of wine at Christmas and New Year's, whether you like it or not.
Exactly, like the glass of sherry with your aunt.
Or the Seder, the Manischewitz wine at the Seder.
Obviously.
I have always liked Manischewitz.
Come on!
Okay. You just lost all credibility.
So I thought that was helpful to break that, because it is another kind of on one model it's a dose, it's further sort of granularity in the dose response curve of alcohol and outcome, and I thought that was helpful. But as I'm sure you're going to get into, Matt,
I'm not getting into anything you are.
There are very fundamental differences between people who currently drink, as opposed to those who currently drink occasionally, and those who used to drink and now don't. Why do they no longer? I think that's a very interesting question. And what is it that distinguishes people who decided categorically to stop drinking that might be very different from people who drink casually and have a glass of wine at dinner? So these groups are not really, it's not like the only thing you're looking at is the dose response curve with alcohol. You're also looking at all sorts of interesting sort of behavioral and psychosocial aspects of these individuals that may also be fundamentally related to the cardiovascular diseases.
Right. And in the interest of full disclosure, how much alcohol have you consumed today?
Today, so far, none.
There we go. Good.
So I think part
it's only noon.
Part of the concept that I think you're trying to get at, Chris, is the concept of a sick quitter.
Yes, a healthy user and a sick quitter. Right. There's two biases there, in fact.
They used to be lumped into the same category, and this study has the power to be able to disaggregate them. And I think it's a really important thing, because you could be not consuming alcohol because you've got cirrhosis, and that is a risk factor for other cardiovascular events.
Right. And this I think has been the criticism of this field in general. And I should say that there have been other studies done. One study that was done here at Boston University that specifically raised this issue of who is the right comparison group. You don't want to compare to people who quit for reasons that might be related to heart attacks and other types of heart disease. But who is the right comparison group? And this other study found that when you account for the sick quitters, as you're referring to them as, that the effect kind of goes away, that actually there's the dose response, that more is worse. But this study doesn't find that, and I struggle a little bit with trying to figure out, which study to believe, which one is better and why. And I don't have the answer to that, but I certainly look to the same things that you all look at, which is, okay, so what else is going on in this population? And the thing that's interesting to me always is smoking, because smoking is such a big known risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Yeah. And as you would expect, the non-drinkers are the group that is least likely to be a current or former smoker. And heavy drinkers are the most likely to be current or former smokers.
Right.
But that would suggest, if you really think that through, that would suggest that the smoking goes along with the drinking, and we know smoking is bad. So the bad effects of drinking may actually just be confounded by the smoking. Right. Now, they account for what they can adjust for, but they have categorized this as current smoker, former smoker, never smoker, or non-smoker. And I'm just not sure that's enough to be able to fully control for the effects of smoking. But that said, it would still do the opposite of what you would think. It would make the protective effect probably appear even greater. So I don't think it fully explains what's going on. And I would, I don't think there's any way to totally tease that out. I don't know your thoughts. Any comments on the way they've actually measured alcohol consumption?
Yeah, I had a little bit of an issue with that, because what they did is they basically took from the medical records of every general practitioner in England, or most of the general practitioners in England, who would indicate in their records the amount of alcohol consumption. And having written in medical records before, I know that there's not a whole lot of consistency in terms of how you categorize or subcategorize the amount of alcohol consumption in your patient. And what they did was to try to, in a post hoc way, categorize all of those reports by the general practitioners into definable alcohol consumption categories. And I think that that's a little woolly.
Right. I would like to support that point, because I think that there are the two extremes on this dose response curve are the ones that are most susceptible to reporting bias. Mm-hmm. That is to say, if you have if you are a heavy drinker and have sort of like problem drinking behaviors, it's unlikely that the alcohol behavior stands alone, that there are probably many other things about your lifestyle that are unhealthy that need to be considered. And B, if you're on the short end of very little alcohol exposure, you also have to sort of wonder, what is it that's driving those individuals away from what would be considered to be normal, which is some alcohol, but not a lot of alcohol. And so both of those two extremes don't really represent a continuous category of risk behavior. Really, they are very different risk behaviors that are potentially confounded with all sorts of other cardiovascular risk behaviors or features.
Like, for instance, again, we're not supposed to be talking about the table, but for those listeners that do, in fact, have the table in front of them, Table 1, you look at the three categories of non-drinker, former drinker, and occasional drinker, and you notice that for those three groups, in comparison to the moderate, heavy, and alcohol status missing groups, they used statins a lot more.
Right. There's something different about them.
So either there's something different about them because they were prescribed statins, or the statins themselves are preventing some of these cardiac events. So that's another form of bias that you're talking about.
Well, I think more generically, if we're talking about observational studies, the risks to the validity of all observational studies there are a few things that are very important. One is that these studies are typically vulnerable to biases of different kinds. They are also vulnerable to confounding, including unmeasured confounders in particular.
Which I would say is a source of bias.
Which is yes, in fact, you're right. So it sort of fits in both categories, I guess. And the third is that observational studies, as a rule, cannot assess causality, with very, very few exceptions. And those exceptions are limited to, cases where you have some external information that makes the direction of causality obvious. Like you go to the picnic and the people who ate the chicken salad got salmonella.
So always the chicken salad.
But it's like, you knew it was the picnic, right? It was that, so you knew the direction of causality. But most of the time, and certainly in this situation, you don't know the direction of causality.
So I wouldn't go that far. I certainly wouldn't go as far as you just went there, but I take your point that when I say I wouldn't go as far, I mean, I think you can assess causality in observational studies, but you do have to make more assumptions.
You have to be careful.
You have to be careful. But I agree with your point. But say more what you mean by the direction of causality. Are you saying that you think that it's potentially possible that heart disease is causing you to stop drinking alcohol?
Absolutely. So there, if you are in one of those former drinker categories who maybe had a heart health discussion with your general practitioner, and the GP said, you're really at high risk for cardiovascular disease. You need to cut down X, Y, Z, and checks down the list. You got to eat nothing but wheat germ, blah blah blah. No, cut out the alcohol, this and that, and this and that. All of those things are not going to be measured in the food frequency form on that form.
Right.
But this is an individual that their clinician has, looking at their, multivariate analysis based on their knowledge of the patient, has decided that this is a risk.
Yep. I agree, and I think this is an area that we need to spend more time thinking about in our observational studies, and how we try to tease that out.
Now, one really important thing about this, as Don mentioned it, is that this is a big data analysis. Huge. It's a really big data analysis. And I just want to make the point that
unbelievably large.
The size.
Oh, don't say it, Chris. Don't say
megalarity,
it. You're not going to say what I think you're going to say.
Humongous of this database does not resolve the question of bias, confounding, and direction of causality. It doesn't make any difference how big the observational database is. Those problems are inherent in the study design, not in the sample size.
So I would actually argue that it makes it worse.
It could, because it gives you beautiful little tiny confidence intervals over confounded associations.
Beautiful little tiny confidence intervals. That's exactly what it does. So to try to make this more plain, that we think about sort of two types of errors in studies. We think about systematic biases and random error. Systematic error are the things that we're talking about. So that's the confounding problem where risk factors party together. Random error is the case where we just get it wrong just by chance, right? That's a very, very oversimplified way of describing. But if you were just doing sampling studies anyway, that's what it would be about. And the bigger your study is, the less and less random error there is. And what that means is you become more and more confident in your findings, even though your findings are biased, because the systematic error doesn't go away. And so big studies can be misleading if you only focus on the random error component and ignore the systematic error.
So we can be wrong with a high degree of precision.
Exactly. And I think that's where we need to be really careful as our studies get bigger.
So maybe we should rename them from confidence intervals.
To
something that doesn't imply that we have more confidence.
There's a whole literature on that I won't get into, but yes, you're.
I think they should just use p-values.
And there might even be a
Oh wow, it hurts. I have. We should do a study on Chris's discussion of p-values and my risk for heart attacks. But anyway. All right. Well, any last thoughts on that? Should we be having our glass of wine or not?
Well, I don't know. I came away with there's two hypotheses here, right? And we don't know which one's true. And hypothesis is one is that alcohol has some biological effect on pathophysiological pathways that alters the effects of cardiovascular disease of different kinds in different ways. Possibly true. Mm-hmm. And number two is that this is all about healthy user effects and sick user effects. Yeah. And this is all due to bias.
Way to come down.
It's all about epidemiologic monkeyness.
Yep.
We just don't know which one's which.
I gotta say, I think that this was an impressive study. I thought it was a well done study with big data that didn't come to conclusions that I think were in excess of what they were trying to sell. If you put this in the context of all of the other studies and all the other evidence, even though we don't have a smoking gun for causality, I think the preponderance of evidence that mild to moderate drinking is protective for the development of cardiovascular disease is overwhelming.
And I'm not sure I buy it.
I'm with Don on this one. I find this one more convincing than some of the other ones that I have looked at, and I find this to be it's got some logic behind it. It's consistent with the data. That doesn't make it right for all the reasons that we've talked about. But I find with this one that I'm open to it.
Well, I'd love to believe it was true, personally.
Right.
But I have to say I'm personally not convinced.
Do you yet believe that cigarettes cause cancer?
Oh, I'm sure they do. But you see, that's an interesting one because in the Framingham Heart Study, this was the risk factor that the most powerful risk factor identified that was a truly exogenous risk factor as opposed to endogenous.
Meaning what?
Means that this is something that comes from outside of the person. This is a personal behavior decision to smoke or not to smoke, but it doesn't have anything necessarily to do with your biology. And so all these other things like cholesterol and blood pressure and sodium are much more difficult to disentangle because they are intrinsic to the individuals.
Can't control them.
Whereas smoking is a factor that really is outside of the person. So it's much more akin to, I think, like the chicken salad and salmonella example than it is to.
I don't buy it.
All right. So it's light up, Don.
So
No, I don't buy that. It's extrinsic and has sort of an isolated effect because smoking is associated with so many other behavioral factors like drinking, like other sorts of behavioral factors that could have an effect.
That is true.
we may be off topic here.
Yeah.
We may be off topic. We will come back to this one another time.
I think what we need to include in future podcasts studies that are not observational and have big data.
We will do that.
Getting a little,
and in the absence of that, until we sort it out, while I go into the swing to segment 2, you two can arm wrestle for who wins this one.
All right.
Sounds good.
So moving on. Now that we've got our decisions on the alcohol hypothesis, we're going to go into our second segment into a topic that I spent a lot of time thinking about as I'm driving home and listening to National Public Radio, and I hear that latest story on the news about some health factor that is either good for me or bad for me, or I'm probably going to drop dead. And I want to get into this idea of what is it that the media chooses to focus on when it comes to covering the public health and medical literature, and then we can get into how we think they choose to portray those particular studies. So, Chris, I'm gonna start with you, and I want you to give us your take on what you think makes a good study that the media is going to pick up, and is it necessarily the best studies?
Well, I guess it seems one common theme is studies that focus on things that people like to do. So I think that's a big hit. So like, alcohol, of course, and caffeine and chocolate, things we've talked about a lot. Whether like red wine from the Napa Valley is better than white wine from Portugal. I don't know if it's a study like that.
Do they get that specific?
I'm just saying, there are certain things that people like to do.
We should do that study.
That would be. We should go to Portugal and do a fact-finding mission.
All right.
Anyway, so I think that's one factor is focusing on things that people like cheese. So if you could find a study that said that cheese prevents anything, people would be so psyched, and it would be in the New York Times for sure.
And does it not trouble you that you can always find a study that says the thing that you want?
Oh yes,
right.
It bothers me a little bit, and now that we have big data,
we
can find more of them. Big.
You really like the big data. Okay, all right. So things that are things that we really like to do. What about you, Don? What catches your eye that the media is trying to portray?
I think the media tends to portray stuff that's sensational, stuff that would be of interest, above the fold interest, either positive or negative. I mean, I think they can be very iconoclastic in terms of shooting down something that is an accepted wisdom. And I think that the conventional media parallels the scientific publication environment in that they don't ever go back and correct the record for scientific research that has been done and found to be faulty. Occasionally they do, and we know that the work that was done by Wakefield and vaccines and autism. I think that there's been a very good effort on the part of the media to go back and try to correct some of those clear errors in the way that those studies were conducted. But that's rare, I think.
And it's very hard to correct the record once it's out there.
Yes,
particularly if it's something sensational. So I was trying to think this through, and I put things into buckets or categories. So it seems to me there is the big impact category, right? The media likes things that are, cancer and heart disease and things that are things that we're all worried about. there's the counterintuitive bucket. So, you find out that chocolate is good for you. We want to get that out there because people like chocolate and it doesn't make sense. And it seems to me a lot of the stuff that comes up around the psychiatric and psychological literature often fits into that category. There's the contradictory finding. So they like it when something comes out that says the opposite of what everything else has said. And there's a fabulous example that I think Ken Rothman pointed me to in the New York Times from many years back in their health section, which had a report on a study that had been done that showed that magnets lessen the diabetic pain, or foot pain for diabetics. And it specifically said in the write-up that this was a tiny study done on about 12 people. The results were contradictory to everything that we've ever found, and we should be very cautious in interpreting it. However, it should be enacted immediately, and everyone should be doing this. So, I think they like the counterintuitive.
Mixed messages.
Yeah. The counterintuitive and the contradictory. And then the other last category that I would put is the media they like drug studies. They like studies that, there's some new medication, because we all like the idea that we can just take a pill and solve all these problems. So I think, obviously, the media is largely about selling advertising or whatever it is, getting people to listen. And I think that's all about coming up with something that is sexy, which which is the topic I want to get into next, which is that serving the interest of their listeners or readers? Chris, what do you think?
No, I guess I would have to say it's not helpful.
Why not?
Well, because it's more entertainment than it is public health.
Yeah.
This is not really about making, population level changes in behaviors on, interventions that are known to be effective. It's much more superficial, and it's here this week, and next week people are focused on asparagus. It doesn't go anywhere.
Yep.
It just adds to the sort of general sort of hysteria of pseudoscience that I think is unhelpful.
Which reminds me, I left out a category, because it was written above the others, which is the fear-mongering category. Which I think the vaccines one, or your change your behavior.
Serious.
If you don't change your behavior, something bad is going to happen, or something's going to happen to your children, and so we're all kind of afraid of these things, and so it sells.
And I think it's a serious problem, because I think that in my mind, we are at this point in a sort of a collective state of questioning science to the degree that we never did. I mean, collectively, not the three of us, but collectively.
Mostly Chris.
That we haven't ever been, and it's really very, very distressing to see the degree to which science is being questioned. And I wonder the extent to which we as a scientific community contribute to it, or we as a scientific community and the media contribute to it, by providing very contradictory information to the public in ways that aren't thoroughly responsible.
Yeah.
And I think it undermines the confidence in science and science's ability to really arrive at fact.
Yep.
And it's very distressing.
I think the point you make, I think, goes back to something that Chris said on the last podcast, which is the more bizarre a finding is, the less likely it is to actually be true, and the less likely it is to stand up to rigorous replication and to be correct. But the media goes in the opposite direction. They love the counterintuitive finding. They love the odd finding. Anything that we could say is going to enhance our lives or make things simpler for us. You just got to find that odd study that says it when the remaining 30 find nothing, and you report on that, and people want to hear that and they want to believe it, so they will look to it.
Yeah.
When you listen, so you two are both people who produce studies that go into the literature. When you hear a story on a new finding, what are your pet peeves or your reactions to this? For example, for me, it's I listen to it and I immediately start thinking about the confounding problems that we've talked about. Are there other things that you think people should be thinking about when they hear these studies?
It's a really good question, Matt. I mean, I think I approach it much as you do. Which is one of the central tenets of science is that we should be skeptical at all times. And the job of science is not to prove your hypothesis, but to try vigorously to disprove your hypothesis. And if you cannot After, applying all that skepticism, then the chances are perhaps it's true. But you always have to be humble and open to the possibility that it's not true. Because actually finding truth, as I think this is the theme of this podcast series, is that finding truth is really, 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 really hard.
It is very difficult.
Really hard. And so we're sort of approaching it from the wrong perspective, rather than like leaping to the conclusion that it must be true because it's based on big data.
Or because we want to believe it.
Or because we want to believe it, and therefore is true.
Except the chocolate one. Chocolate is good for you.
Well, that's categorical fact. That is absolutely unimpeachable.
And possibly alcohol, too.
And yes, right. And cheese.
Well, but it begs the question, are the goals of science and the goals of media reporting on science fundamentally out of sync?
They are, because the media is viewing this from the perspective of entertainment rather than from public health. And I think that bias is wrong. Like you're saying, the sensational things are what get picked up. The sensational things are almost, by definition, most likely to be wrong. And so they shouldn't be picking them up, because we should be most skeptical about those rather than least. And yet they're there because they're fun and get people's attention.
But I think it's important also not to impugn all media, because I think that there are responsible outlets that will report on scientific findings, put them in the right context with all the right descriptions of limitations and provisos and caveats, and then there are other outlets that will pick that up and present the findings that may be sensational, without a discussion and proper presentation of all the limitations.
Well, let's go back to your headlines, Matt. Like, based on those 4 or 5 news outlets, which of those do you think actually accurately reflected the degree of uncertainty about the relationship with alcohol and cardiovascular disease?
Yeah, not many of them. Certainly
Wine
not.
Spectator.
That's totally unbiased, obviously. I mean, a pint a day keeps the doctor away. I'm going to say that's going in the wrong direction. But moderate drinking linked to lower risk of some but not all heart conditions.
That's fair.
It's probably not cautious enough. But I thought there was one that was moderate drinking may reduce heart disease risk. Well, that's fairer. Yeah. It is possible, but people don't want to hear it may, right? People want to hear that it does.
Right.
And I think it's complicated. And I take your point that there are definitely good reporters out there. And the job of a health reporter, is a complicated task, because you have to break down concepts that are used to figure out these findings and explain them in a, if you're lucky, a 2 to 3 minute report. Can you actually convey the limitations?
Should really tricky.
I mean, should the media only be reporting on things when there's an entire body of evidence that now supports this, as opposed to the first study that finds
I think
eating ice cream prevents cancer?
One of the media outlets that is, in fact, really responsible and has, I think it's only been published over the course of the last couple of years, is STAT, S-T-A-T, which appears in the Boston Globe. And they kind of do more in-depth, almost investigative reporting of scientific findings. And they are kind of long, sort of in-depth long journalism approach to reporting on scientific findings. And I always learn something when I read those articles, and I find them, pretty unbiased and quite responsible.
Yeah. Well, it would be hard to get into a headline, the really accurate summary, which would be, in this observational study prone to bias with confounding and unmeasured confounders, where the direction of causality cannot be inferred. There was a modest association. That doesn't just...
No, you lost me at modest.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. As opposed to a pint a day keeps the doctor away.
There you go.
I like that one.
All right. Well, we're not gonna solve this one, but I appreciate the thoughts. Okay, so let's move on to our third segment, our amazing and amusing segment, where we want to highlight some things that make us enjoy our jobs even more than we already do. Don, what do you got for us?
Matt, again, I'm going to dip into the well of the University of Leicester in England to talk about some of the physics reports that have been published in their journal, which is the Journal of Physics Special Topics. And I really recommend that the listener go to that website and look at some of these papers that have been reported.
I usually see people reading that on the beach.
I'm sure you do. Yeah. So the first one I wanted to report on was Indiana Jones and the Fridge to Freedom. The bridge to freedom. Right.
Not the bridge, the fridge.
So Mansfield, Willis, Doggett, and Coley reported in 2016 a paper that investigates the plausibility of Indiana Jones being able to survive the initial gamma ray radiation from a nuclear explosion by containing himself within a lead-lined fridge.
Wait,
As you remember,
so many questions.
In the
So
2008
many
film Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of Crystal Skull, Indiana is Indiana is left stranded in a nuclear test town.
I didn't see it.
He is seemingly doomed to certain death as the nuclear bomb is activated and the siren begins to count down. With literally seconds to spare, he's able to squeeze himself into a lead-lined fridge, surviving the explosion and aftermath without any noticeable injuries.
Sounds about right.
In this paper, they explore the plausibility of Indiana being able to survive this event by investigating how thick the lead within the fridge would need to be, such that the initial gamma radiation given off by the bomb is no longer harmful to Indiana. And they go through this exhaustive description.
The conclusion?
And the conclusion is, therefore, we conclude that it is unlikely Indiana would have remained unharmed from the gamma radiation, as the minimum thickness of lead needed is 4.58 centimeters, which is likely to be greater than the thickness of the lead lining within the fridge. He may, however, have been able to survive the gamma radiation if the whole fridge was made from lead as opposed to just lead-lined. It is unknown exactly what this thickness of the fridge is. All aspects considered, however, he would have almost certainly been killed by being caught up within the blast of the bomb, with the fridge being subject to an enormous amount of force. However, cannot be further investigated.
So many questions come to mind.
Wouldn't the fridge of the lead have melted?
You would think.
So many questions. So
again, I want to make a plug for this particular course at the University of Leicester. I think they have done a fabulous job at getting these undergraduate physics majors interested in real-world problems.
So question one, whatever happened to willing suspension of disbelief? And can I now publish a scientific article which cites the willing suspension of disbelief at the beginning? Question two, did my tax dollars pay for that?
No, this is England.
Oh, okay.
No, the students' tuitions paid for this.
Oh, excellent.
And these are all thought experiments. I mean, there's nothing other than
I see. There's no one collecting. They didn't actually put Indiana Jones in a lead.
No, they just do physics calculations to determine. They make assumptions about how thick the lining would be, how big the refrigerator is.
Got it.
So no nuclear bombs on the Isle of Wight.
Got it. All right.
And next time I'll talk about another zombie epidemic.
I like that you give us a little preview. I like that. All right.
Well, I can't
Chris,
that.
Over to you. And this time I'm hoping that I can understand it.
Okay. Well, that makes two of us, I'm afraid,
right.
because this one was more than I could really almost tolerate. I was overwhelmed by the topic. A couple of months ago, a student in one of my lectures said, "Why are so many viruses icosahedrons?"
And an icosahedron
An
is?
icosahedron is a 20-sided three-dimensional thing, like a Dungeons and Dragons 20-sided dice.
Knew you were going there. Knew you were going
That
there.
is an icosahedron.
And
I'm
what level dungeon master were you? I don't know if that's a thing, but is that a thing?
No, but that's okay. We've got the right idea.
Chris, say a few words in Klingon for us.
I don't speak Klingon.
Sure
but,
you do.
No, that's just a rumor. Anyway,
Sure you do.
No. And anyway, there were no Klingons at my wedding. This is another rumor.
That is not the story we hear.
Yes.
Okay. Icosahedrons.
I married a lass from Lothlorien. That is true, however. Anyway, the question turns out to be a really good question. Like, why are so many viruses icosahedrons? And I had to say,
why not?
When the student said this, I have no idea. That's an excellent question. So I went and tried to find out. And then turns out that there's the textbook chapter in a book, and I'm afraid the thing I printed out here doesn't say the name of the book, but chapter 3 is Principles of Virus Structural Organization by Prasad and Schmidt, without a T. And it is actually kind of fascinating, and it has to do fundamentally with energy states and with equilateral triangles. And if you sort of think about like what a virus needs to do, viruses are very, very small, and they have very, very small genomes, and they have to be uber efficient. And so when they're creating their structures, what you want is to create subunits that only require one gene or a very few number of genes to be as maximally efficient as possible. And so if you can create 3 proteins that link together and form an equilateral triangle, then these equilateral triangles can self-assemble, kind of like, making, if you can imagine like 3, triangles with little magnets at each end, you can link them together. And then the icosahedron becomes the maximally efficient 3-dimensional form for a series of triangles. And they will just automatically, naturally self-assemble as a series of triangles. Now, that's only part of the answer because you have more complicated viruses where the facet, the triangular shape, is itself created out of multiple subunits that form together to make, it's kind of like that Japanese paper game when you have the little shapes of paper and you have to put them into different, make little patterns out of them.
Do you know that game, Don?
That's not origami, I guess.
It's not origami, but it's similar. And so you're putting them together to make, but it all comes down to equilateral triangles. And there's this one picture which I think you can't see, but it's kind of fascinating, where you have a lattice.
The listeners definitely can't see it.
2-dimensional lattice of 3-dimensional triangles laid out flat. And what they really want to do is they want to roll themselves into a ball. Now, when Watson and Crick were looking at viruses, they talked about spherical viruses, but we now know there are no spherical viruses. Viruses are icosahedrons. They're not actually spherical because a sphere is not a structure you can make out of rigid building blocks like proteins.
Got it.
Proteins are stiff, so they can't form spheres. They have to form geometric forms like icosahedrons. And the trickiest part, because if you want to encapsulate your genome on the inside of this thing, you need to have a rigid structure that will protect the precious inner workings of the virus. And the icosahedron turns out to be the most stable geometric form to do that. And it just occurs naturally in nature. And it's fascinating. And the tricky bit, which I was like scratching my head about, is like if you imagine you starting with this flat plane of equilateral triangles that want to fold themselves, how do they know to fold up and capture the viral RNA inside it, or fold down and exclude the viral RNA?
And
right?
the answer is
that most viruses, there's a separate step where the genome is injected into the structural sphere after it has been manufactured. And that usually one of the facets at one point, or at several points, but usually one point, there'll be a tethering point which attracts the viral injecting apparatus that forces the genome into the assembled icosahedral shape. It was absolutely fascinating and complicated.
All
but
right,
I think we're going to
totally
have to
cool.
rename this segment. It can't be wacky science anymore because this stuff that you're talking about is not.
We said things that fascinated us as well as amused us.
All
so
right.
it is technically within the bounds, but I will say, Chris, you have been true to your nature, and I am going to do the same. So I'm going to follow along for my theme from last podcast when I was talking about the peer review process and the statue that was made to the peer review process. So, as I mentioned, the peer review process can be quite frustrating. And so there are somebody or a group of people, I don't know, who put together a Twitter handle, a Twitter feed, where you can send in the comments that you get from your peer reviewers.
This is excellent.
It's called @YourPaperSucks. And I will say I have lost at least 3 full days of productivity because once you get started, you cannot stop reading these things. And I'm just going to read a few of my favorites. And I gotta pull it out here because the pinned tweet, the one that's sort of at the top from November 2014 says, "I'm afraid this manuscript may contribute not so much towards the field's advancement as much as towards its eventual demise." Okay, so this is another one. It says, "This paper is wrong on almost every point, but wrong in interesting and important ways. This manuscript in the present form is not a review article, but is rather a number of research papers stapled together. The writing and data presentation are so bad that I had to leave work and go home and then spend time to wonder what life is about. You need to learn how to think inside the box and stop smoking whatever it is you're smoking." And this
That's
one,
gratuitous.
that is a little gratuitous. This is my absolute favorite one. "Why do you have so many tables? Did you go to IKEA?"
My reviewers never have a sense of humor. They just insult me.
No, they do not.
Mine just feel angry.
Yeah. Well, it's my goal to get something on there.
I'd love to see the responses that people wrote to those.
I know. It's got to be absolutely fascinating. Well, that's the end of our show for today. If you've got any feedback on this show or any others, and you want to get in touch with us, you can reach us at PopHealthEX. That's at PopHealthEX. Thanks for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed it, and we hope you download our next episode.